Welcome to our Marketing Measurement and Attribution 101 webinar or podcast. My name is Michael Chertuti, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Strala. Today, we would like to share with you a few things to help educate you on measurement, on different models, and how we as marketing organizations can get the most effective insights out of our measurement capabilities. So hopefully what we get out of this brief webinar or podcast are a few things. Hopefully one is a deeper understanding about the different models that are deployed and used in today's marketing measurement. Number two, helping understand which models are right for you. And lastly, hopefully not being overwhelmed or even fooled by some of the trendy talk and buzzwords around AI and machine learning as it pertains to the models. So right off the bat, one of the things that's most challenging for marketers is being able to answer a very simple question, such as, was our marketing campaign profitable or not? And many of us are faced with questions like this, and then we get into the details and all the nuances, and there are a lot of challenges associated with answering this type of question. Can we slice and dice our data by different marketing channels? Can we slice it by different promotions? Do we understand what metrics we should be looking at when we're really talking about profitability or return on investment? Are we looking at orders, or are we looking at the full lifetime value of a customer? And so answering this question isn't as simple as one might think. So when we think about the state of marketing measurement in today's day and age, we did some research. And one of the things that we found in this research is that only 11% of marketers feel very confident in the accuracy of their attribution models and their marketing measurement capabilities. And if we peel back the onion a little bit, it's interesting to find out what we see. I think one of the culprits has to be this one. 46% of marketers measure channels in isolation. That could mean they're looking at email or search or display or TV. Sometimes we're a little bit more sophisticated and we're looking at multiple channels, such as our paid channels together, such as paid search and paid social, display advertising, paid video, or maybe we're grouping our traditional advertising like out of home and print and TV together, but still we are challenged to measure holistically across these different channels. Additionally, and one of the things that is a big contributing factor to this notion of why maybe we don't feel as confident in our models, it's not only about the data and measuring this data in these isolated channels, but also for the last 20 years, the vast majority of us are still using what is known as a last touch or a last click digitally attribution model. And as a result of that, we're not applying credit to multiple touch points throughout the customer or the buyer journey. And interestingly, 20 years ago when I started off in digital marketing, this was the primary mechanism that we were using, was this notion of last touch attribution. And still 20 years later today, we're still, the vast majority of us, using this very simplistic, rather unsophisticated model. So if we go a little bit more deeply into this and we start to understand what are we trying to measure, marketers today are really focused on efficiency and ROI of their dollars invested in paid media channels like digital media for paid social, search, display advertising. We're obviously concerned, and we have been for many years and even decades, about our traditional advertising investment. Also, we're really focused on growth. So growing revenue, growing customers. As a matter of fact, we've seen many titles within marketing organizations come about where they are called head of growth or growth marketing, properly attuned to this focus on growth of a business. Additionally, we're looking at lifetime value also, although that's a more elusive metric for us to try and measure. Additionally, last but not least, we still are looking to try and measure awareness and reach where applicable. If we take a look a little bit more deeply in some of the capabilities and methodologies and technologies that we're using for this holistic measurement, many of us are still using web analytics. Now, web analytics is a fantastic measurement capability for understanding digital and our websites and our web pages, although many of us are still using this for attribution, and web analytics was not built for measuring online and offline touch points and touch points throughout the entire customer journey beyond our website. And so it's interesting to note that only 13% of marketers today are using a third-party attribution solution that's not web analytics, something more sophisticated that takes into consideration digital and non-digital touchpoints, as well as across the entire experience. Interestingly, 57% of marketers today, the way they try and get to measurement is they extract all of the data across all of their different channels, and then they put them together, they co-locate them, and they expect to try and find ROI or results from that. That is a mechanism, and it's challenging because we're all still doing this, but again, only 11% of us find that we are very confident in our ability to measure results doing this. Additionally, last but not least, 60+% of marketers are still using UTM tracking and homegrown campaign tracking spreadsheets to try and measure the attributes or the campaign IDs. And this is also contributing possibly to this notion of not having confidence because of a lack of standardization across data, metadata, classifications, and the like. So if we look across all of the different channels that marketers are attempting to measure, and we were to prioritize these and stack rank these, marketers are tending to favor these days digital channels. Now, obviously, traditional media has a very important place in the media mix. If we look at the survey results, we're starting to see items such as email still being number one, being able to have that direct interaction with their customer, closely followed by paid social. We're looking at organic social, then the website, display, paid search, SEO, and then you start to see some of the other traditional channels creep in across all marketers, across all industries, such as print and events and field and retail and TV and radio and out-of-home areas. And so it's interesting to see that digital has really shifted and come into its own in terms of these different marketing channels. Now, one of the challenges, of course, of trying to track and measure these different channels and what's contributing to the lack of trust and inhibiting our ability to measure ROI and attribution, first and foremost, interestingly in the data, what we see is, number one, inconsistent tracking across different channels. It's closely followed by the number two area of insufficient staff and talent to aggregate and manage the data. We think that by co-locating the data, running lots of analysis and trying to comb through this data, getting it to act like one data set is going to help us. Now, in some cases that's true. Most of the time, though, if we set up our tracking correctly and focus on the number one challenge, then the data can act and move like one data set, and so we actually require less data to make this happen. Number three area that's inhibiting our ability is siloed data across channels. Number four, incomplete data. Number five, inconsistent data standards spanning channels. This is where we're starting to get into that metadata and those UTM parameters that we use for digital tracking and having inconsistencies across those data standards. Last but not least are the models themselves, and marketers rank in number 6 in the top 6 areas is the insufficient attribution models. It goes to show, of course, with the research that 72% of us are still using last click or last touch attribution models. So if we think about the results here in what's inhibiting our ability to measure results, it looks like first and foremost it's a data problem led by inconsistent tracking, and then the siloed data, inconsistent data, incomplete data, and then we have this siloed, incomplete, inconsistent data feeding inadequate attribution models. So obviously there are some good reasons why we don't feel confident in our ability to measure marketing's results. So let's talk a little bit about the models. Now obviously no model is perfect. There's a famous quote that's attributed to the statistician George Box, and it says, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." So hopefully we can peel back the onion and understand measurement a little bit more. But before we dissect the models, let's go a little bit more deeply into the constructs and the raw ingredients of measurement. So there are really 2 to 3 ingredients for measurement. We really need to know, number one, who. And that notion of who can be an anonymous ID or profile, it can be a known ID or a known profile. And what we're trying to do is take that known identity and we're trying to stitch together the multiple touch points across the customer journey that lead to the third ingredient, which is the conversion event itself. So you get who, did, what, when, across these different touch points, across different channels, across different promotions and channels, and messaging leading to an end conversion event. And so those end conversion events could be leads, They could be orders, they could be sales, they could be closed opportunities in a B2B complex sales cycle, they could be inclusive of the full lifetime value of the customer proxy. And so really, again, those three ingredients are, number one, who did what, when. In a B2C account, we're really looking at one individual. In a B2B case, an account, we're looking at two individuals or more. In those who are influencers in the buying cycle, decision makers, so we could have 20, 30 people on the account. And so we're trying to understand all of those various touch points across those individuals rolled up to an account in a B2B scenario versus just an individual in a business to consumer scenario like retail or financial services. So these are the 2 to 3 raw ingredients. Now, I say 2 to 3 for a reason. If we are talking about media mix modeling versus attribution, with media mix modeling, we are not needing one of these ingredients. And that ingredient that we don't need is the who, that profile, because that's where media mix modeling came from. It's trying to tie together our investment in traditional media historically, where we haven't been able to associate the identity or those user actions to a specific set of touch points, such as investments in different channels like TV and print and radio, culminating into an event of conversion. So basically what we're doing is we're leaving that one out because we can't measure it adequately. And so with attribution, however, we're looking at all three raw ingredients. Who, connecting that to known or anonymous profiles, did what, those different touch points, leading to a conversion event. And so let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons. So I've got this media mix model report. Obviously, the image is not a high fidelity image. We did that on purpose because typically media mix modeling is not high fidelity itself. And so what we see in these different images are things such as investments in TV, investments in magazines, investments in possibly different PR campaigns. What we're measuring here are things such as how much money did we invest in these different channels, and what was the correlative or corresponding increase in unit sales. The pro of media mix modeling is we're measuring these when we can't tie these to an identity or a profile. And it helps us to identify base momentum and that brand effect as well if we were to shut off some of our paid advertising. Now, the cons associated with this is because it's not necessarily high fidelity, it's correlative. It typically works only for paid channels where we can measure that influx of when we're investing in something or not, but you can also start to bring in some of those other channels like PR and the like. Also, it typically requires 2 to 4 years of channel investment and unit sales data in 2-week increments, because what we're looking for is fluctuations. We're looking for increases or decreases in those different channels. We're trying to isolate those investments in channels and understand the corresponding increase or decrease or no result in unit sales. So that's a little bit about media mix modeling when we can't associate that to a known profile or an identity. So there are some pros and there are some cons associated with this. Now, if we talk about attribution pros and cons, basically this is where we bring in that third ingredient of that who, and associating it to that known profile or that anonymous profile. The pros with this is it's much more deterministic with multiple models. It works for all channels where you can connect to profiles. It's very statistically significant if you are capturing a complete data set, because you're really looking at a population of the entire set of users where you can track and associate their touch points and conversions back to the identity. Also, if you do this right, many attribution providers in the space are really focused on which channels or maybe which publishers or sources to focus on. If you do this right, you can also understand attribution for messaging, content, promotions, in addition to those publishers and content, and then you're really able to go deep and dissect which promotions work within which channels, which content types and formats, so you get this really rich ability to understand the insights. Cons, not all channels have this level of data where you can connect to a profile. We talked about that with media mix modeling. So now that we understand a little bit about the pros and cons of media mix modeling versus attribution and the raw ingredients for each of them, let's go in and talk a little bit more deeply about some of the attribution models themselves. Before we do so, though, let's make sure that we understand really two things that are critical. So whenever we're looking at the outcome or the report or a dashboard, we're really focused on the metrics. And we're focused on the metrics that are the conversion metrics. If it's a B2B scenario, we're looking at inquiries and marketing qualified leads and sales qualified leads, closed won opportunities, and the dollars associated with those. If we're looking at a B2C scenario, we're looking at orders and customers, the order value, if there are possibly returns that we need to net out of that. And for both scenarios, for B2B and B2C, we're looking at return on investment for our paid media channels and maybe even for content that we're investing in. That's really a key aspect of our dashboards and report. Sometimes something that's really overlooked, though, are the campaign attributes of these, the ways we slice and dice this data. So things like, yes, I want to be able to evaluate my metrics and my leading touch points, such as people interacting or clicking around or visiting in events or in a physical store. I want to understand this by which channels, which mediums, such as email or display or search or others where I can connect that to that profile, or an event where I can take that contact's information or a list of contacts and upload that to that event and then associate it back to these metrics. Also importantly are these notion of these attributes around campaign themes or different content types or tactics, personas, and the content meant for different personas, the journey stage associated with this content, and the products or the product categories that we're promoting. Again, this is a very rich set of attributes that sometimes we're often overlooking in our attribution and our reporting. But again, if we set this up correctly and we track correctly, we can understand both the metrics and these deep granular insights at those campaign attribute levels to slice and dice our reports. So again, in summary, we should be focused on our metrics, looking at our different channel attributes such as medium or source, as well as looking at those content attributes. Again, typically this is where digitally those UTM parameters come into place and those messy, gnarly spreadsheets that we're using to try and bring together some level of consistency across a standard taxonomy for marketing. Speaking of taxonomy, if we think about what this should look like, we should always have a standardized set of attributes when we're trying to unify our marketing taxonomy. So again, we're looking at different channel attributes, we're looking at different content attributes, and by having a complete taxonomy, it allows us to slice and dice the data in a very robust way. So now that we're armed, let's start looking about the focus on these different attribution models. Now, as we showed earlier in the research, we see that over 70% of marketers are still using last touch or last click attribution. And what's really interesting is that there are very few people that are using statistical models that are more sophisticated. The other models that marketers are tending to use more than the statistical models or the mathematical or the machine learning models are maybe other heuristic models such as FIRST or linear or time decay. So let's get into those and let's dissect some of these. Now, as we get into this, it's really important to understand what those touch points look like. So what I'm sharing here is a little bit of data from one of our customers. We've anonymized it, and what we see is 10 or so different profiles, and we see numerous touch points leading up to a conversion event. These touch points, you could see as many as 20, 30, 40, 50 different touch points prior to a conversion event. If you're a B2B account and you're rolling together multiple touch points across all of the people and on the account who have interacted with your brand, whether they've been to an event or a trade show or visited your website, or they've downloaded a white paper or a webinar, or it's those that you've interacted with in a B2C scenario, we see on average about 13 different touch points preceding a conversion event. And so when we think about a last click or a last touch attribution model, what we're really doing is creating an index. And we're indexing possibly our investment and our decisions off of the last one that is the most recent prior to that conversion event. And sometimes that's not the best way of doing this. And so one of the things that's really important is to understand when we're talking about attribution, we're taking all of the touch points into consideration, if we can get them, and then we're putting them into an array based on time when we're looking at the first engagement and first touch, all the way through these multiple advancers leading up to the last touch preceding a conversion event. So obviously there are some basic human-driven single-touch models, also known as heuristic models or rules-based models. These tend to be things like last touch, where we don't give any credit to the preceding. Let's use the example of the industry average 13 different touch points. We're not giving any credit to the 12 preceding touch points, but we're giving 100% credit to that last touch point preceding the conversion. If we're doing this on a first touch basis, which is something that we've seen long since been shed, but just to explain it, we're giving 100% of the touches to that first event in that sequence of those example 13 different touches preceding the conversion event. Now, it's interesting if you start to compare which touch points are driving the first touch versus the last touch, you're going to get a very large mixed bag across different channels, against different types of content, promotions, journey stage. That's why it's really useful to try and start to put IDs and track different stages within the customer journey and associate that to your campaign attributes and your products and your product categories and your campaign messages and themes to see if there is variation, not just in addition to your channels, across first and last. Now, it's interesting. So these are the more simplistic models. Now, the second category would be those, again, still those basic human-driven or those models, but now we're looking at multi-touch attribution. Here we're looking at possibly position-weighted or time decay. With a position-weighted model, we're going to give more credit to the first touch and then to the last touch preceding the conversion, and then we're going to evenly distribute less credit across those touch points in between. If we look at a time decay model, we're going to give less credit to those first interactions and more credit to those last touch points preceding a conversion event. And so these are much more sophisticated in that we're at least associating credit and we're creating more than just an index based on one singular touch point, and we're trying to apply credit again across the industry average to maybe those 13 plus touch points in a more concerted way. The last one is going to be a model that is more of that algorithmic or machine-based multi-touch attribution model. Some people put this into the category of artificial intelligence, AI. So in essence, what's taking place here is that we're letting the machine do the work for us. And what we're doing is we're taking all of these different customer journeys into consideration. And what's taking place is we're looking at both which ones are leading to conversion events, but also we're looking at those journeys that aren't leading to conversion events or maybe haven't had time to create that conversion path over a period of time. And so the machine is informing us and evaluating and identifying different patterns across all those different touch points that could be representative of different channels, again, different content promotions, different messaging, different persona content purposes. And so what we're doing here is we're letting the machine enlighten us as to the weighting of all of these touch points that are leading to successful conversions, as well as it's taking into consideration those that aren't. If we think about this algorithmic attribution and using the math to do so, really interestingly, if we look at the conversion rates across the industry, they're probably somewhere in the 2 to 3% conversion rate mark for a website across the industry. So basically, if we're using some of those less sophisticated models, we're ignoring 97% of those customer journeys, if you will, that aren't leading to conversion. And then we're creating indexes based on those different paths and customer journeys that don't contribute to a conversion event. So that's why it's so importantly to evaluate and think about the different conversion paths that are leading to and not leading to conversions when we consider the algorithmic and the mathematically driven machine learning models, because they can take those into consideration as well as not take those into consideration. And it's really fascinating. When we start to do some analysis, we see as much as 15 to 30% lifts when you get your attribution models more correct and using a more sophisticated approach to that. All right, this brings us to the conclusion of our podcast and webinar. So a few key takeaways here. Number one, we should evaluate the pros and cons of each of these models. Again, whether we're using a media mix model or an attribution model, we should really understand the differences and when it's appropriate to use different models. And we say it could be valuable to be using multiple models in tandem to make those investment decisions. Number two is decide which model is best suited for you based on these different situations. And again, there could be multiple models. The last point is don't be overwhelmed. Don't be fooled even by the industry jargon of AI or machine learning. Essentially we're relying on the machine to do the math for us and look at the data and evaluate it. But really it's just looking at the models and using math to do so and recognize patterns across different touch points leading to different conversion events. Again, all models are wrong, but some are useful, so there's no such thing as a perfect model, but we believe that by using the more sophisticated models, you're able to make much better decisions regarding your investment, and you should see those lifts in your marketing investment in both ROI and growth and revenue. And so again, what we see in the industry is that anywhere from 15 to 30% using the same investment of our resources in creating content and our media dollars, we typically see between 15 to 30% lifts by using the more sophisticated attribution models and being much more confident in our measurement capabilities. Thanks for tuning in. Please come back for more insights, and we'll be producing more of these podcasts and webinars, help us better understand insights, attribution, measurement, and the like.